In a quiet corner of central Ohio, in a small community called Nashport, there lived a couple whose story would eventually travel around the entire world. Not because of anything extraordinary they built or achieved in the way the world usually measures extraordinary lives, but because of something considerably rarer. 70 years of marriage in which two people, by every account of those who knew them best, simply never wanted to be apart. This is the true story of Kenneth and Helen Felumlee, two teenagers in the 1940s. Kenneth Felumlee, known to nearly everyone in his life simply as Kenny, met Helen when they were both teenagers in the early 1940s, in the small, close-knit world of central Ohio during the years just before America's full entry into the Second World War reshaped so much of ordinary American life. They dated for several years, the way young couples often did in that era, their courtship unfolding against the backdrop of a country on the edge of enormous historical change. But Kenny, by every account passed down through his family, was not a young man inclined toward patience once he'd made up his mind about something. And he had made up his mind, fully and completely, about Helen. On February 20, 1944, the two of them eloped, traveling across the Ohio River to Newport, Kentucky, because Kenny, just 2 days shy of his 21st birthday, was still too young to marry in Ohio without additional permission. Rather than navigate the additional paperwork and delay that Ohio's laws would have required, they simply crossed state lines and made it official themselves. "He couldn't wait," one of their sons would later explain, decades afterward, describing his father's particular urgency about marrying the woman he loved. It's a small detail, but it tells you something essential about the kind of certainty that would go on to define the following 7 decades of their life together. Building a life in Nashport. Kenneth worked, throughout much of his early career, as a railroad car inspector and mechanic, later transitioning into a role as a mail carrier for the Nashport Post Office, steady, unglamorous work that anchored the family financially across the decades that followed. He remained deeply active in his community throughout his life, teaching Sunday school for years at the Nashporterville United Methodist Church, a quiet, consistent presence in the small town he called home for his entire life. Helen, for her part, built her own quiet but expansive legacy within their community, not through paid work outside the home, but through a life dedicated to caring for others in ways that extended well beyond her own family. She cooked and cleaned not only for her own household, but for other families in the area who needed help. She taught Sunday school alongside Kenny. And she became known, affectionately, throughout Nashport for what her family came to call her greeting card ministry, a lifelong habit of sending handwritten cards for birthdays, for moments of grief, for holidays, to seemingly everyone in her community, each one accompanied by a personal note. She kept Hallmark in business, one family member later joked, a small, warm detail that captures something genuine about the particular way Helen chose to show love to the people around her. Together, Kenneth and Helen raised 8 children, building a household that, by every account from those who grew up inside it, was defined by a steady, visible devotion between their parents that none of their children ever remembered as anything other than constant. A marriage defined by simply never separating. What made Kenneth and Helen's marriage so remarkable, in the eyes of the family and community who watched it unfold across 7 decades, wasn't a single dramatic gesture or extraordinary achievement. It was something quieter and, in its own way, considerably harder to sustain. An apparent, consistent refusal, across 70 years, to ever spend even a single night apart from one another. Their children would later describe specific, small examples of just how far this commitment extended. During one family trip that involved an overnight ferry crossing, with only a single bunk bed available for the two of them to share, Kenneth and Helen chose to squeeze into the lower bunk together rather than take separate beds for even that one night. It's the kind of detail that sounds almost impossibly quaint from the outside, and yet, by every account, it was simply how they lived, an unbroken, 7-decade pattern rather than an occasional romantic exception. Every single morning, for as long as their children could remember, Kenneth and Helen ate breakfast together while holding hands, not a performance for anyone else's benefit, but simply the ordinary, daily texture of how they chose to start each day of their life together, year after year, decade after decade. When Kenneth retired in 1983, and their 8 children had grown and largely left the family home, the couple discovered a shared love of travel, eventually visiting nearly all 50 states together by bus. Kenneth, notably, refused to fly not out of fear, but because, as one of his sons later explained, he wanted to actually see the country passing by outside the window as they traveled, rather than missing the journey itself by flying over it. The final years. In the years before their deaths, both Kenneth and Helen faced the kind of declining health that often accompanies advancing age. Kenneth had, roughly 2.5 years before his death, undergone a leg amputation related to circulatory problems, a significant health challenge that Helen, by that point in her late 80s herself, took on the role of helping to care for him through. Their daughter, Linda Cody, would later describe how, even as both of their bodies grew frailer with age, each of them made a visible, consistent effort to stay strong for the other. The same quiet devotion that had defined their entire marriage, now showing itself in the particular, difficult work of caring for one another through the genuine hardships of old age. April 2014. Helen Felumlee passed away on April 12, 2014, at the age of 92, surrounded by her family, in the same central Ohio community where she had spent nearly her entire life. According to her family, approximately 12 hours after Helen's death, Kenneth, 91 years old himself, and clearly, visibly affected by the loss of the woman he had spent 70 years beside, looked at his gathered children and said simply, "Mom's dead." What followed, according to his family's account, was a rapid, unmistakable decline. Surrounded by 24 of his closest family members and friends, gathered at his bedside, Kenneth passed away the following morning, just over 15 hours after Helen. His son Dick later described those final hours as something the family chose to treat not simply as a loss, but as a genuine, deliberate farewell, singing Kenneth's favorite hymns at his bedside, reading scripture, praying together as a family in the room with him. "It was a going-away party," Dick said afterward, "and we know he loved it." Linda Cody, reflecting on her parents' nearly simultaneous passing, offered a simple, direct explanation that resonated with millions of people once their story spread across news outlets around the world in the days that followed. "We knew when one went, the other was going to go." What their story meant to the world. When the Felumlee family's story was first reported locally by the Zanesville Times-Recorder, and subsequently picked up by the Associated Press and news outlets across the globe, it resonated with an intensity that surprised even the family themselves. Shared and read by an enormous number of people who found, in this quiet Ohio couple's 70 years together, something they recognized as genuinely, increasingly rare. Their story arrived at a cultural moment when conversations about marriage, commitment, and lasting partnership were increasingly complicated. A period when many observers had begun openly questioning whether the kind of lifelong, deeply devoted marriage Kenneth and Helen represented was still achievable, or even still valued, in the way it once had been. Their story offered, to an enormous global audience, a simple, undeniable example that it still was. Epilogue. Kenneth and Helen Felumlee were not famous before their deaths, and they never sought to be. They lived a modest, rooted life in a small Ohio community, raising 8 children, showing up for their neighbors, attending the same church for decades, choosing, again and again, across 70 full years, to remain beside each other rather than apart. What made their story travel so far, in the end, wasn't anything extraordinary in the way the modern world usually measures extraordinary lives. It was the sheer, sustained consistency of an ordinary devotion, hands held over breakfast every single morning, a shared bunk bed on an overnight ferry rather than even one night spent apart, a husband who, by his family's account, simply couldn't bring himself to let his wife of 70 years go on alone, even for a single day. Their daughter's words remain, for many who encountered this story, the simplest and most enduring way to understand what Kenneth and Helen Felumlee actually built together across 7 decades. "We wanted them to go together, and they did." And,